Welcome, curious minds, to what we're calling the Religious Studies podcast for this particular deep dive. And just a note before we begin. This exploration has been crafted using advanced AI, but rest assured, all the information comes from and has been meticulously verified against our source material.
That's right.
Today, we're embarking on a pretty fascinating journey, I think, into the mind of Claude Lévi-Strauss. Now, that's a name that might immediately bring up thoughts of, heavy academic theory.
Oh, definitely. Rigor, complexity.
Exactly. But as we'll discover, there's also this surprising, almost poetic sensibility to him.
Indeed, and that's really our mission today. We want to unpack the core ideas of this, foundational figure in anthropology. We'll focus on his understanding of myth, obviously, but also, and this is really intriguing, its profound connection to music.
Myth and music. Okay.
Yeah, we'll explore his concept of duality, how these opposing ideas shape human thought, and ultimately how he saw things like myth, language, even a Wagnerian opera as being woven from, remarkably similar underlying structures.
Okay, that sounds like quite the undertaking. So let's unpack this. Claude Lévi-Strauss. You hear the name, you think anthropologist. Right, pioneer.
Right.
But there's this great little story, apparently, that kind of captures this dual nature you mentioned. He was visiting Berkeley, and the hostess, apparently trying to place him, asked, "Oh, wow, the anthropologist or the genes?"
He must have heard that a few times. But it's funny because that anecdote, it perfectly encapsulates this idea of the two of him that our source material talks about.
Right, the two lions.
Exactly, like that mythical beast from Woody Allen. The head of a lion and the body of a lion, but not the same lion. He was born in 1908, became professor of anthropology at the Collège de France in 1959, famous as the founder of structural anthropology.
Which he first really laid out in Anthropology Structural back in 1958.
That's the one. A landmark work.
So, okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. On one hand, he's seen, by some at least, as this cold, cerebral critic, kind of a mathematical Mr. Hyde.
Mm-hmm. The guy writing mythologics, these incredibly dense theoretical volumes, trying to boil myths down to logical patterns, even using formulas like that canonical formula.
Right, the ABCA1, that kind of thing. Very abstract.
Very. And yet you also have this lyrical Dr. Jekyll side, the passionate, maybe even political poet who wrote Triste Tropiques in 1955.
Ah, Triste Tropique, yeah. That's much more widely read, isn't it?
It is, and it's sort of rescued anthropology in a way from just being dry and scientific. He brought in this introspective, subjective style. He wasn't afraid to admit he was interested in the messiest, juiciest aspects of human culture, eating and killing and marrying.
So the raw stuff of life alongside the abstract formulas, that's quite a pairing.
It really is. And this leads to another key tension, this dichotomy in his work, the pull between particularity and universalism.
Meaning?
Well, all his data, his raw material, came from very specific fieldwork, with tribes like the Bororo and Jivaro in South America. Deeply particular stuff.
Right, detailed ethnographic work.
But then, from that very specific data, he spun these grand theories that implied universal claims about how all human beings think. Deep structures common to everyone.
Ah, I see. So grounding it in the specific, but aiming for the universal. Did he acknowledge that reach?
He did, yeah. He even acknowledged a debt to Freud, calling him the father of all latter-day universalists. And in Myth and Meaning, the book we're drawing on heavily today, he kind of finally steps out of that closet universalist role, as the source puts it.
Interesting. But why the hesitation? If he was making universal claims, why, as the source suggests, did he sort of protest against being labeled a universalist?
Well, one intriguing suggestion from our source is his terror that he might be mistaken in the dark for Jung.
Ah, Jung, another theorist of universals archetypes.
Exactly. But Levi-Strauss's approach was different, much more focused on formal, logical structures, binary oppositions, not so much a collective unconscious in the Jungian sense. He wanted to maintain that distinction.
Makes sense.
And what's really compelling about Myth and Meaning is that it's presented as the place where these, let's say, opposed pairs of Levi-Strausses really come together.
The Hyde and Jekyll finally shake hands.
Something like that. It's perhaps his most lucid, candid, and personal explanation of his big ideas. You really feel you get the man himself, not just the theory.
Okay, so we have this figure wrestling with dualities himself. How did that then translate into his understanding of myth? How do we decode myths using his approach?
Well, for Levi-Strauss, fundamentally all mythology is dialectic.
Dialectic, meaning a kind of argument or back and forth.
Precisely. He saw it as humanity's attempt really to make cognitive sense of the world, of all the chaotic data that nature throws at us. But, he argued, this very attempt inevitably traps our imagination in a web of dualisms, of binary oppositions.
Like good versus evil, raw versus cooked, those kinds of things.
Exactly, those kinds of things. Male, female, life, death, nature, culture. He proposed that each dualism, say male-female, creates this tension. And it seems like it gets resolved by a mediating term, maybe androgyny in this case.
Okay, so a resolution.
Ah, but here's the catch. That new term, androgyny, it doesn't end the process. It just becomes one half of a new dualism. Yeah. Maybe androgyny versus sexlessness or something else. It's an infinite chain, potentially.
Wow, okay. No easy answers then.
Not really. And this is crucial because he saw myth as a form of language. And he believed language itself kind of predisposes us, pushes us to impose these dialectics, these dichotomies, these binary grids onto experience, even if the experience itself isn't inherently divided that way.
So language structures our thought, forces us into these boxes.
In a way, yes. And he thought it went even deeper, right down to the binary nature of the brain itself.
The brain? How so?
Well, think about it. Right and left hemispheres, good and evil as concepts, life and death. He saw these as almost inevitable dichotomies produced by the brain that has two lobes and controls two eyes, two hands.
So our physical structure shapes our thinking.
That was his argument. We're split creatures by nature, organizing data like a simple digital machine. Yes, no, no. Our basic common sense, he'd say, is binary. It divides experience in half, then halves those halves, always asking yes or no questions.
Okay, so we break everything down. What are the pieces called?
The pieces resulting from this breakdown, the fundamental units, he called mythemes.
Mythemes, like phonemes in language.
Exactly like phones. That was the analogy he drew from the linguist Roman Jacobson. Phonemes are the smallest units of sound that make a difference in meaning, right? Like P versus B.
Pat versus bat. Got it.
So mythemes are the smallest units of mythical meaning. And the big idea is that different myths, even from wildly different cultures, might be built from the same basic mythemes, just arranged differently. It reveals a shared deep structure.
And these mythemes get reused.
Constantly. He saw myths like old tools, things in constant use. They break, they get fixed, they get lost, they get found again. And the person who finds them, who tinkers with them and puts them back together in new ways, that's the bricoleur.
The bricoleur. The handyman.
This cosmic handyman, yeah.
Yeah.
Recycling narratives, pulling together these rags and bones, as the poet Yeats put it. And each piece, each mytheme, brings its own history, its previous life history, into the new story.
That's a powerful image. Now, you mentioned Myth and Meaning, the book. It has a rather unique origin story, doesn't it?
It really does. It wasn't originally written as a book. It started as a series of talks he gave in English for the Canadian Broadcasting Company, the CBC Massey Lectures.
In English, which wasn't his first language.
Right. And he actually admits in the text, quite candidly, I simplify very much because it is too complicated for me to explain this in English.
That's fascinating. So the simplification required by speaking English actually led to maybe a clearer explanation.
Paradoxically, yes. It forced a kind of clarity. And this connects to another important point. He makes his distinction between what used to be called primitive thinking and civilized thinking.
Ah, yes, that's a tricky distinction.
Very. And Lévi-Strauss argued strongly against the term primitive. He said we should rather say without writing.
Okay, so the key difference is literacy.
For him, yes. He observed that people in societies without writing often develop really unique sensory perceptions, different ways of thinking, maybe mental capacities that we, in highly literate cultures, have perhaps lost or let atrophy.
Interesting. So the oral nature of Myth and Meaning.
Exactly. The fact that he was speaking these ideas, not polishing them in writing, perhaps allowed him a certain sensitivity and power of expression, as our source puts it, that might be missing from some of his more complex written works.
Now, his structural models, these abstract patterns, they sometimes get criticized, don't they, for being sort of timeless, disconnected from history, like they exist in some Platonic realm.
That's a common critique, yes.
Yeah.
That they lack historical grounding.
Did he address that? Especially in Myth and Meaning?
He did, quite explicitly. He argued that myths have both diachronic and synchronic aspects.
Okay, remind us. Diachronic is?
Diachronic is how things change through time, like tracing the history of a myth's development.
Hint synchronic.
Synchronic is looking at the structure at one point in time, how the elements relate to each other, kind of outside of historical flow. And Lévi-Strauss argued, you need both perspectives. He tries to put historical flesh on the structural bones, especially in essays like Hair, Lips, and Twins, the splitting of a myth, where he trains us how a myth evolves culturally.
So he wasn't ignoring history, just arguing the structure was also crucial.
Precisely. And myth and meaning, perhaps because of its spoken origin, presents these arguments with a real personal force.
Okay, this is all fascinating background on his thought and methods, but now let's get to this connection you mentioned earlier, the one between myth and music. You said it was really central for him.
Deeply personal, yes, and absolutely central, though often misunderstood. He saw not just one, but two kinds of relationship going on there. Similarity and contiguity.
Similarity and contiguity. Okay, let's take similarity first. How are myth and music similar in structure?
This is key to his whole way of reading myth. He argued that you can't really grasp a myth just by reading it straight through, line by line, like a novel.
Okay.
To really understand it, you have to see it as a totality. The core meaning, he believed, isn't in the chronological sequence of events, but in bundles of events, related elements that might appear at completely different points in the story.
Bundles of events. How does music relate?
Think of reading an orchestral score. You don't just read the first violin line from beginning to end, then the flute line, right?
No, you read the whole page at once, vertically as well as horizontally. You see how the different parts interact.
Exactly. You read vertically, top to bottom, understanding the whole page, the whole moment, as a totality. Lévi-Strauss said you have to read myth the same way, treat it like an orchestral score, looking for those vertical connections between related myth themes scattered through the narrative. Only then does the deep structure emerge.
That's a really powerful analogy. Okay, so that's similarity. What about contiguity?
Contiguity is more about their historical relationship to proximity and cultural function. He had this compelling idea that as mythical thought started to, let's say, recede in Western culture, maybe around the Renaissance, into the 17th century.
As science and rationality gained ground.
Perhaps, yes. As that happened, he felt that music, specifically Western classical music he mentions, Frescobaldi, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner, started to take over the intellectual and emotive functions that myth was kind of leaving behind.
So music stepped into the gap left by myth.
In a sense, yes. It evolved, changed its forms to fill that void, to carry some of the same structural and emotional weight that myth used to carry.
Wow. Can you give us an example? You mentioned Wagner earlier. How does this play out in, say, the Ring Cycle?
Wagner is a perfect example for Lévi-Strauss. Let's take just one musical theme, or leitmotif, the theme associated with the renunciation of love.
Okay, I think I know that one.
It first appears quite literally in the Rheingold, right? It's like when the dwarf Albric renounces love to steal the Rheingold and gain power. Simple, direct.
Right. Makes sense there.
But then it reappears, quite mysteriously, in the Valkyrie. It plays when Siegmund pulls the magical sword from the tree and recognizes his long-lost twin sister, Sieglinde. And they fall passionately in love.
Well, wait, so the renunciation of love theme plays when they're falling in love? That seems contradictory.
Exactly. On the surface, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
He's doing the opposite of renouncing love. And then the theme appears again later in the Valkyrie when Wotan, the king of the gods, is condemning his daughter Brunhilde to sleep surrounded by fire, essentially taking her godhood away.
So Alberich giving up love for gold, Siegmund finding love and a sword, and Wotan punishing Brunhilde. Three very different situations, all linked by the same music. What was Lévi-Strauss's insight here?
His brilliant insight was, don't treat these as separate events. Put them together, pile them up, superimpose them, treat them as variations of one and the same event.
Okay. And what emerges when you do that?
A deeper pattern. In all three cases, there's a kind of treasure that has to be forcibly pulled or torn away from its resting place.
A treasure.
Yes. The gold has to be torn from the Rhine. The sword has to be pulled from the tree of life. And Brunhilde, the beloved daughter, has to be torn away, metaphorically, through Wotan's judgment and encased in fire.
So the gold, the sword, and Brunhilde, they're structurally equivalent.
That's the idea. They are fundamentally one and the same thing, viewed from different perspectives. Gold represents a means to power, gained by renouncing love. The sword represents a means to love, gained by embracing forbidden love. Brunhilde is maybe love itself, or the consequence of divine action. This structural view suddenly makes sense of why Brunhilde, at the very end of the cycle, returns the gold to the Rhine.
Because they're connected at this deeper level.
Exactly. And it also illuminates other things, like the strange twin relationship between Hagen, the traitor who ultimately kills Siegfried, and Siegfried, the hero himself, because both, in different ways, conquer Brunhilde. It unlocks the plot through structure, not just narrative sequence.
That's quite something. And you mentioned this kind of structural understanding, this continuous reconstruction, also happens when we listen to music itself.
Yes, absolutely. Think about listening to a symphony or any complex piece. You wouldn't get any pleasure or real understanding, would you, if your mind just processed each note and forgot it?
No, you have to hold it all together somehow.
Right. You have to muster what you have listened to before and what you are listening to now, and to remain conscious of the totality of the music, as he puts it. Themes return, variations develop. It only makes sense when you perceive the structure over time, superimposing the present on the past.
So, music didn't just take over myth's function, it actually ended up using similar structures.
Precisely. He believed that when music developed its specific forms, things like the fugue, the sonata, it wasn't inventing structures out of thin air. It was, in a way, rediscovering structures which already existed on the mythical level.
Can you give an example of that? The fugue, maybe?
The fugue is a great example, formalized around box time, right?
Mhm.
You have the main theme, the subject, then the answer comes in, often at a different key, like a chase. The interweave develop.
Right.
Lévi-Strauss saw this as a direct, almost literal representation of myths that feature two characters or groups pursuing each other, interacting, and finally coming together in some kind of resolution or conjugation of the two principles, just like the resolving chords in a fugue. He even found myths he felt were structured like sonatas or rondos.
So the patterns were already there in storytelling, and music just gave them a sonic form.
That was his argument, a deep structural parallel.
There's that wonderful story about him trying to find a musical form for a specific myth involving his composer friend.
Yes, René Leibovitz. Lévi-Strauss had this myth, or rather a group of myths, with a peculiar structure, basically, two different stories that started separately and gradually intertwined and eventually merged into one. He couldn't think of a musical form quite like it.
So he called the composer.
He called Leibovitz and described the myth structure. Leibovitz apparently confirmed, no, there's no established musical form exactly like that. But then, and this is the great part, Leibovitz was so intrigued by the mythic structure that he went ahead and composed a piece based on it.
Wow. So myth inspired a new musical form.
Exactly. It perfectly illustrates this deep reciprocal relationship Lévi-Strauss saw. It's not just music reflecting myth, but potentially myth-revealing structures that music could then formalize.
So bringing it all together then, language, myth, music, they share structures, but they're not identical.
Right. He pointed out key differences in their levels of organization. Language, he said, has three main levels: phonemes, the basic sounds; words, meaningful combinations of sounds; and sentences, meaningful combinations of words.
Okay, phonemes, words, sentences.
Music, he argued, has something like phonemes, maybe tonemes or basic sound units like notes or timbres. It definitely has sentences or phrases, but it lacks that distinct intermediate level of the word, a fixed unit combining sound and definite meaning in the same way language does.
Interesting. No dictionary of musical words. And myth.
Myth, on the other hand, clearly uses words and sentences borrowed from language, but it lacks the foundational level of the phoneme. Its basic units are already meaningful concepts, the myth themes we talked about.
So compared to language, both music and myth are kind of missing a level.
That was his structural analysis, yes. Each lacks one of the levels present in language's sound and meaning combination. It highlights both their connection to language and their unique natures.
And this connection was deeply personal for him. You said he wanted to be a composer.
He really did. Apparently he dreamt of it since childhood. He even wrote a libretto and painted stage sets for an opera he conceived. But he felt he couldn't write the music, that something was, quote, lacking in his brain for musical composition.
Yet he clearly had such a deep feeling for it.
Absolutely. He felt music, like mathematics, was somehow innate. He tells this lovely story about having dinner with the composer Darius Milhaud. Milhaud described how, as a child, he realized he was a composer when he started hearing his own music, not just remembered music, playing in his head as he fell asleep.
A kind of inner necessity.
Yes. And Lévi-Strauss seemed to feel that if he couldn't compose with sounds, maybe he could achieve something similar with meanings, with the structures of myth.
Do it with meanings. That's a beautiful way to put it.
Didn't it? He saw music and mythology as these two sisters, begotten by language, who had drawn apart over time, and he even speculated further. Just as he saw classical music taking over myth's role centuries ago, maybe he wondered something like serial music in the 20th century was starting to take over the function of the traditional novel, as that form seemed to be receding from the literary scene.
Always looking for those structural shifts and replacements.
Always the quest for the underlying patterns.
So we've really covered a lot of ground here. We've explored this fascinating, often paradoxical world of Claude Lévi-Strauss, his own dual nature, his theories about the binary structures deep within myth, and this really surprising, intricate symphony he saw between myth and music. It really feels like he was searching for something fundamental underneath it all.
I think that's exactly right. He himself described the structuralist approach as a quest for the invariant, or for the invariant elements among superficial differences, looking for the constants beneath the chaos.
And our source material offers a little advice too, doesn't it? Something about knowing when to jump off the train.
It does, rather cheekily.
Yeah.
It suggests the trick is to jettison Levi-Strauss right before the moment when he finally deconstructs himself. And it reminds us that understanding these complex journeys, these myths, often requires a lot of transfers, using different lenses, theological, psychological, anthropological. His isn't the only way, but it's a powerful one.
Definitely powerful. So for you, our listener, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's maybe a thought to take away. Levi-Strauss urged us to look beyond the surface story, the simple sequence of events, and find those deeper bundles, those underlying structures that reveal the real meaning.
Mm-hmm.
If we accept that knowledge is most valuable when we can actually understand it and apply it, and that critical thinking is just essential, especially now with so much information coming at us,
Right.
how can you maybe apply Levi-Strauss's method? How can you look for those invariant elements among superficial differences in the news you read, the stories you hear, the narratives you encounter every day? How can you see past the surface to uncover the deeper structures that might really be shaping the message?
That's a great challenge.
Something to think about.
This has been another deep dive with the Religious Studies podcast. We really hope you found this exploration of Levi-Strauss as thought-provoking as we did.
It certainly gives you a new way to look at old stories. It really does. If you enjoyed exploring these rich connections, myth, language, music, the structure of thought itself, please do follow the Religious Studies podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
That'd be great.
And if you're feeling particularly generous today, a 5-star rating really does help us reach even more curious minds just like yours. Until next time, keep digging deeper.